Good evening, and thank you for joining me. My name is Jeff Yanc. I'm the program director at the Loft Cinema, and I'm here in the Loft Cinema administrative offices, which are now empty for reasons well known to all of us. And I'm here with my picture of one of my favorite comedic actors, Peter Sellers, as Inspector Clouseau. And today we are going to discuss the new documentary, The Ghost of Peter Sellers, directed by Peter Medak. And this is a film that we are currently streaming through the Loft Cinema website. And this is a fascinating movie to me for a number of reasons. One is that it's a representative of one of my very favorite genres of documentaries, subgenres of documentaries, specifically movies about movies gone horribly wrong. So they're disaster films, not disaster films like The Towering Inferno or The Poseidon Adventure, or disaster films, but movies that had disastrous productions. And there are a number of films in this genre, and we could talk about those in a minute. I'd like to hear if anyone has any particular favorites in that genre. But this is one of them, for sure, because this was the film that's documented in this film is an epically infamous Hollywood disaster. So Peter Medak is the director of this documentary. Peter Medak, interestingly, was also the director of the original film that this is about, called Ghost in the Noonday Sun from 1972. So this film that we are discussing tonight actually recounts the production history of that film, Ghost in the Noonday Sun, which starred Peter Sellers. And Peter Medak, prior to this, had a great career as a director, a British director. Actually, he's Hungarian, but worked in England. Probably his most famous film prior to this was The Ruling Class with Peter O'Toole, which was sort of a weird comedy musical about a man who thinks he's Jesus Christ, and it's Peter O'Toole. So Peter Medak, after working with Peter O'Toole, and then the next year working with Peter Sellers, obviously had experience working with, possibly problematic leading men. Peter Medak also made a film called A Day in the Death of Joe Egg, starring Alan Bates, the year before he made this film. Some other great films. He made The Changeling in 1980 with George C. Scott, another allegedly problematic actor to work with, but also a brilliant actor. Zorro the Gay Blade with George Hamilton. Romeo is Bleeding with Gary Oldman. So Peter Medak is still making films today, mostly working in television. But if you've seen this film, The Ghost of Peter Sellers, you know that the making of Ghost in the Noonday Sun is a pivotal turning point in Peter Medak's career as a filmmaker, because he feels like that movie really derailed his promising career at that point and set him off on a different path than he would have otherwise, because of all the insurmountable problems that happened while making the film. So Ghost in the Noonday Sun, just if you haven't seen that original film, 1972 comedy, sounds like it's going to be great. The concept is great. It's a 17th century pirate comedy starring Peter Sellers, one of the funniest actors in history, as a sleazy pirate named Dick Scratcher. So that kind of gives you an indication of the humor level of the film. Dick Scratcher, who kills a ship's captain in order to take over the hunt for a buried treasure. So he assumes the identity of this dead captain whom he's killed. But the dead captain comes back as a ghost, and Dick Scratcher, Peter Sellers, has to rely on the ghost's help to find this buried treasure. So, sounds kind of insane. Probably an ill-fated project from the beginning, just conceptually. Now, this movie that we're talking about, the documentary Ghost of Peter Sellers, kind of revisits the troubled production of Ghost in the Noonday Sun, and kind of looks at all the behind the scenes disasters. A lot of it's very jaw dropping, even if you've seen a lot of these kinds of films about films that have gone horribly wrong. Some of the things that happened behind the scenes of this movie are kind of shocking. Not the least of which was a leading man who was, of course, brilliant, but was also continually, for some reason, attempting to sabotage the project of which he was the star, and which, by the way, was his idea to make the movie. He convinced the producers to take this project on, convinced Peter Medak to come on board as a director. And then once Peter Sellers got to the set, he decided he did not want to make this film and did everything he could to destroy the film, which is pretty fascinating. Now, Peter Medak, the director of both of these films, I believe, and he claims this in the documentary, and I believe this is true, he's the first director to actually make a documentary about the making of a film that he actually directed previously. Most of the other films in the genre about movies about horribly gone wrong films are directed by other people who are sort of looking through the wreckage of what happened to this other filmmaker's film. But Peter Medak is revisiting his own horrible experience making this film, which is kind of interesting, kind of masochistic, I would say. A lot of the reviews for this film have questioned why Peter Medak wanted to make this film in the first place. What was he getting at? What was the point? I think there's some self-punishment going on here. As I mentioned, a little masochism. There's obviously some guilt about what happened on the set. There's, I think, anger at Peter Sellers that has lasted for 48 years now. But there's also a strange, if you've seen the documentary, there's a strange kind of love for Peter Sellers that I think Peter Medak has never gotten over. Just an artistic love. He really respected Peter Sellers as an artist and has never quite gotten over the fact that he had such a horrible experience working with Peter Sellers. So let's dig into this. And do we have any questions? Oh, here's Gary Gassel saying, it's amazing to me that Medak would want to revisit that experience, and even more astounding that he still seems to love Peter Sellers, the man. Exactly. It is astounding, and it is kind of confusing, which makes this documentary very interesting, I think, and complicated. And it's not just a making of documentary. It's really a psychological portrait, both of Peter Sellers and of Peter Medak, and to what drew them together. So I guess my first question is, if anyone who is joining us for this chat this evening has actually seen the original film, Ghost in the Noonday Sun. So if you have, please let me know. The film is not easy to see. The film was never released theatrically. Columbia Pictures, who owned the film, did not like the film. They were, I think, a little embarrassed by it. They did not release it to theaters. It did come out on VHS in the 80s, and it is not currently available, of course, on VHS. It has never come out on DVD here in America. If you're really interested in this film, you can purchase a Region 2 DVD of this on Amazon, which is a British region DVD. And it's worth checking out if you have seen the documentary and you're interested in what the final product was of all of this drama that went on making the film. The film is not streaming anywhere. Again, I think the studio was not really that thrilled with the movie. I have seen, Patrick Barabee says, I have not seen Ghost. Well, Patrick and others, it's a mixed bag, I would say. I have seen Ghost in the Noonday Sun. And a documentary like this, I think, really piques your curiosity, and you really want to see, is this a lost classic? There has to be something interesting in this film to have caused all of this drama behind the scenes. And I'm going to say probably not. Ghost in the Noonday Sun is not a very good film, let's be honest. And I love a good train wreck. And I love watching movies that have been maligned by critics and have notorious backstage histories, and films that maybe have unwarranted bad reputations. But Ghost in the Noonday Sun, you can, when you watch the film, because the film was completed, it's not very good, and it was clear that it was probably never going to be a hit. It's a little juvenile. It's very confusing. If you've seen the documentary, you know that they were constantly doing rewrites on the film. Peter Sellers kept disappearing. A lot of disasters happening, the pirate ship sinking, etc. And it really affects the flow of the film. The film doesn't make a lot of sense at all. But I'm going to say it's still a Peter Sellers vehicle. So there's still a lot of moments in Ghost in the Noonday Sun that are very funny and very worth watching. But overall, I would not say it is a lost classic. But as I said, you can see it if you're very diligent and you want to buy a copy or Region 2 Blu-ray or DVD copy from England. So what is the point? Oh, okay, wait, we have another comment here. Steven Spataro says, I have seen it about 3 times. I have the VHS from Virgin Vision, 1989. Yes, and I believe that's the copy I saw. The version I saw. Casa Video here in Tucson used to have a VHS copy of this film. They no longer do. And we have another comment here, by the way. If you buy the British DVD, check if your player can play Region 2. Correct. Region 2, not all DVD players will play Region 2 DVD, so please check your instruction manual. So why was this film made? I think this documentary is really a fascinating document on how not to make a movie. Sort of an autopsy of a failed film, I think, in a lot of ways. I love when one of the producers of the original film is talking to Peter Medak, and he says, you should never make a film simply because you can make a film. You should only make a film if it's ready and if it needs to be made. The implication being Ghost in the Noonday Sun never needed to be made, but they had funding because Peter Sellers was a very bankable star at that time. So they got a relatively large budget for this film from Columbia Pictures, $2 million, which was a big budget back in 1972. But perhaps the film didn't need to be made because it seemed like no one really had a passion for it or really understood where the film was going, least of all Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers, as I mentioned, it was his idea to make the film. He was very hot in 1972. He got the director involved, Peter Medak. He got the producers involved, and it was his idea. He was a bankable star. Everyone knew he was difficult to work with, and that's the thing about Peter Sellers. If you have read any books about Peter Sellers or seen interviews with Peter Sellers or heard anyone talk about Peter Sellers who worked with Peter Sellers or who was married to Peter Sellers or who was a child of Peter Sellers, you know that he was a difficult person in a lot of ways. Kind of had a bad reputation in terms of his work ethic. Although he got along great with Stanley Kubrick, which I find very interesting. And of course, he made 2 great films with Kubrick, Dr. Strangelove and Lolita. So I think this raises an interesting question about Peter Sellers today. So in 1972, we certainly did not have the cultural discussion about separating the artist from their art that we have today. Looking at celebrities, actors, musicians that have troubled personalities but create great art. And I'm curious if anyone has any ideas how you think Peter Sellers would fare today in the cultural climate of the year 2020, different from the way he was perceived during his heyday of the 1960s and 1970s, when pretty much everyone knew that he was a difficult person, but gave him a lot of leeway because he was a genius, and he was a genius. Even one of his ex-wives, Brett Eklund, said that he was a genius, but that as a human being, he did not have a lot to recommend him, and she actually had children with him. I think he would have had a more troubled career had he still been alive today, or had he been in his heyday today. So that's just my opinion, but I think, again, brilliant actor. This is a document of an epic disaster film. Clearly, the script was not finished. constant rewriting of the script. The budget was too small. We see in the film the producer saying, we didn't really secure enough funding for what you were trying to do with the film, Peter Medak. It was too big of a production, and that's really a fault of the producers. That wasn't really Peter Medak's fault. It was a film shot on the ocean in Cyprus near Greece. Shot on the ocean, and if you are a buff of the making of movies, documentaries, books, etc., you know that generally when a film is shot out on the open seas, it's trouble. There's a great book called The Jaws Log by Carl Gottlieb, who was the screenwriter of Jaws, who wrote a book about the making of Jaws and how problematic that was, filming that movie out on the ocean with the shark malfunctioning and the waves crashing the boat around, and difficult to set up a camera in the water. So also Waterworld, the Kevin Costner film, which was a disaster on a different level. But generally working on the ocean is tough. Even Titanic, the James Cameron film, that was filmed in a tank in Mexico, I believe, on a set. But filming out on the open sea, trouble. So that was going to be a problem for this film. Peter Medak, of course, says, like, I had no idea what I was getting into, filming on the water and filming with Peter Sellers on the water, an extra problem. What does Gary Gassel say? Yes, money is quite the aphrodisiac. A big star can take advantage of people today, just like back then. Yes, it's true. When actors, actresses, directors, etc., get a lot of money for a project, it does give them then the incentive to not be on their best behavior always. I think another comment, I think they discussed that point a bit in the film. Water is too much trouble. It is too much trouble. But when it works, like in Jaws, Jaws is clearly a film that overcame the problems of working on the water and became a classic movie. Of course, the pirate ship sank on the first day, crashed into the rocks off Cyprus, and that was a problem. I think one of the other problems with this film that they sort of hint at in the documentary, but they don't explicitly state, is that they filmed the movie in Cyprus. So it was far away from studio interference. And I think that was one of the ideas, like, we want to film this far away so we can do whatever we want, which was probably helpful for creativity, but also a problem because no one was there to watch over their shoulder and say, what are you doing? You're wasting money. What's up with Peter Sellers? We're going to pull the plug on this, because Columbia Pictures apparently did not know a lot of what was going on because the production was happening so far away from Hollywood. And so the production kind of ran amok in that sense, because no one was really policing the project. Here's another comment here. I think Sellers' eccentricities would be forgiven more easily today, but if he violated other people's boundaries, I think he would have been held more responsible for his behavior. Yes. And I don't know, and I have never really heard that Peter Sellers was, someone who was an abuser of women. I don't think that was an issue. He was not nice to most people, just in general. Kind of dismissive and not empathetic. But yes, I think if he did cross boundaries, he would probably be held to the fire today for sure. And of course, there wasn't just one loose cannon on the set of Ghost in the Noonday Sun, but there were two. Of course, Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers' pal from The Goon Show, which was a fairly famous 1950s British radio show that the two of them were on, and made them both very famous in England. Spike Milligan was also a little nutty. Spike Milligan always claimed that making The Goon Show with Peter Sellers, because it was such a successful show, and because of the pace of the show, it was a radio show, I think it was weekly, that he ended up having, Spike Milligan had a nervous breakdown writing for that show because of various reasons, possibly working with Peter Sellers, but also just the pace of trying to be funny that frequently for that long. The show was on for, I think, almost a decade. Caused him to have a nervous breakdown. He himself was manic depressive. And I think this is an interesting note about the pressures of comedy. I think if you don't do comedy, maybe it's difficult to understand possibly like the pressures of being funny all the time. And I think that was possibly one of the problems that Peter Sellers had in his personal life was the pressures of being one of the world's greatest comedic actors and continuing that for decades is a problem. So he was referred to as Hurricane Peter Sellers on the set of this film, and indeed he was. He was mercurial. What I find interesting in the movie that he was very high on this project, as the documentary points out, but when he came to the set, he had just broken up with Liza Minnelli. So he was very depressed when he came to the set. Now, Liza Minnelli and Peter Sellers, to me, in the pantheon of unlikely or just kind of baffling movie star couplings, ranks very high up there. Maybe like, I don't know, if Jerry Lewis had dated Dolly Parton, something like that. Just seemed like an odd pairing, but it was very short-lived. I think it was a couple months, and then they broke up. So, of course, he came to the set, was firing producers right and left. Interesting in the film, I think, was his relationship with his co-star, Tony Franciosa, who was a classic Hollywood actor who was in Hatful of Rain and The Face in the Crowd and a lot of films. I think Peter Sellers was genuinely worried that Tony Franciosa was going to kill him in the sword fighting. If you remember in the documentary, Peter Sellers refused to be in the same frame as Tony Franciosa because he was afraid that Tony was going to maybe stick him with the sword when they were fighting. So there's a lot of great footage in the documentary of Tony Franciosa sword fighting with no one, and then cutting to Peter Sellers, who filmed his scenes later. Steven Spataro says, I read that Peter Sellers and Tony Franciosa had a fight on the set due to Sellers' antics. Yes. So that's what we're discussing here. They did not get along, but Tony Franciosa also greatly admired Peter Sellers. But Peter Sellers, as we see in the documentary, was a bit jealous of other actors who received attention on films that he was making. So I think there was some jealousy on Peter Sellers' part for Tony Franciosa, which led to this real animosity between the two actors, and they would not be in the same scene together. They wouldn't talk to each other. Peter Medak and Peter Sellers were not talking to each other at a certain point. Talking is important when making a film. You have to communicate with your actor and your director. So that was also a problem, that no one was communicating clearly. But Peter Sellers knew that he was a little bit of a jerk and that he was pushing people's buttons because he was clearly frightened of Tony Franciosa, and probably rightfully so. Probably the most jaw-dropping moment in the documentary is when we discover that Peter Sellers faked a heart attack to get out of making the film. That's pretty amazing. People knew that he had a heart condition. It was well established for years. He had had a heart condition. So he wanted off this set, and he pretended that he had a heart attack while filming a scene, and everyone kind of believed it because they knew he had a heart condition until the director sees him. Well, he goes back to England to go to his doctor, and then the director sees him in the newspaper, a photo of him hanging out in London with, I think, Princess Margaret, when he was supposed to be convalescing in a hospital. So that's kind of the extent. That, to me, that sort of symbolizes like how kind of eccentric Peter Sellers was, and kind of how maybe untethered from reality he was, that he thought that was fine, and then he brought a fake note from a doctor saying, yes, I did have a heart attack, but he really didn't. Interesting. But I think Peter Sellers had a lot of problems. I think he probably had a lot of undiagnosed and untreated mental illness issues. And they sort of hinted that in the documentary. Clearly, he was prone to paranoia and jealousy, had a certain lack of empathy. I think he was maybe manic depressive. But none of those issues were diagnosed for him. So I think a lot of that just ran rampant. And so there's a certain amount of sympathy for him in a way. That was also a time before there was widespread cultural knowledge of mental illness. Certainly less so than today. But still, kind of a jerk. And I'm curious what anyone thinks about this. Let's see what Marcy Albert has to say. She's commenting. I can't believe he worked after faking the heart attack and leaving the movie. I don't think that would ever fly in today's world. Probably not. They knew that he faked the heart attack when he came back. Yes. And they had to finish the film. They had too much of the film shot to abandon the movie at that point. So they let him get away with it. I don't think now that would have happened. I think they would have probably fired him, no matter how big of an actor he was. I've always thought that one of the maybe Peter Sellers' biggest issues, and there's footage in the documentary of Peter Sellers in an interview saying this, and I've heard him say this a lot, is that he felt like he had no real identity as a human being, that he was a blank slate, that he lived through his characters. And a lot of people who worked with Peter Sellers, including Peter Medak, the director of the film, said that once Peter Sellers got off camera, he would often just shut down, and it was impossible to talk to him as a person because of this sort of lack of identity issue. And he was this complete chameleon, which I think made him effective at playing multiple characters in films like Dr. Strangelove, because he could so easily assume other identities. And that's one thing that makes him a great comedic actor, I think, is that you don't see a lot of his personality coming through these characters. Like, he totally commits and loses himself in his characters. Let's see if someone else has a comment. So, not to put you on the spot, but is the documentary a provocative insight into a train wreck, or is it entertaining also in other ways, maybe even a bit humorous? Well, that's why this is such a fascinating documentary, I think. I think it's both. I think it's both a provocative insight into a train wreck, but I think it's also hilarious. It's fun to watch. Some of it's kind of troubling, but it's very fun to watch. If you're a fan of movies and movie making, it's fascinating and it's fun, and your jaw's just hitting the floor while you're watching this because you can't believe what's going on and what Peter Sellers is getting away with. Yes, I would say it's all of those things. And of course, Peter Sellers kept trying to sink the film because he knew that he would still get paid because of the deal he had, even if the film didn't get finished. What I find interesting is that Peter Medak had a real sense of responsibility to finish this film because his reputation was on the line in a way that Peter Sellers wasn't. Peter Medak was not a hugely known and established director at that point. Peter Sellers' reputation was secure. He could behave however he wanted and people would still hire him. Nobody cared. This was after the first Pink Panther film. He continued to make Pink Panther films after this, which were, of course, huge films. But Peter Medak really needed this film to work and to finish the film so that his reputation would not be sunk, because this was a big budget film with a major studio, and he was worried that no studio would hire him if he didn't turn in a completed film, which is why the film itself, the completed film, is not that good, because it clearly was not really finished, but it was finished. They turned in a completed film, but it needed a lot more work. That's, of course, the conundrum of Hollywood. You can't afford not to finish a film, even if the film is a train wreck and you can see that it's not going to be good and it's not going to work and that audiences aren't going to like it and that the studio's not going to be happy with it. Once that train starts rolling, because there's so much money tied up in the film, you can't just abandon a project and leave it. Hollywood is actually littered with films that have been finished but never released for that very reason, because they had to be finished. But either the director, the producers, or the studio was not happy with the film, but they did it anyway. They had to finish it anyway. I'm curious what everyone thinks about this. So clearly, Peter Medak has still ambivalent feelings about Peter Sellers and the film. I love when the producer of Ghost in the Noonday Sun sits down at the round table with Peter Medak and says, look, the film didn't work. You need to get over it. It was a silly comedy. It wasn't going to change the world. You are still alive. You survived. You need to get over it. Which I think is an easy thing to say, but the impression I get, and please let me know what you think, is that Peter Medak is really working through these feelings he had for Peter Sellers. That he felt like he was betrayed by Peter Sellers in a lot of ways. And I felt like he really loved Peter Sellers in an artistic, professional way. And I think this is a real cautionary tale of not meeting your heroes. Because clearly he sort of worshipped Peter Sellers, and because Peter Sellers was so awful to him, I think it really hurt Peter Medak as a person. I think he had his guilt over not making the film the best that he could make, but I think it really hurt him personally that Peter Sellers was so mean to him. And so I think a lot of it was this kind of hero worship that went askew. And I don't know if any of you have ever met someone that you really respect and they've turned out to not be all you hope they would be, but I have, and I won't name any names. But it can be tough. It can be very disillusioning. And Peter Medak is clearly still wrestling with this. I love the round table scene in the film where all of these directors, like the director of Casino Royale, the director of The Changeling, which was Peter Medak, some of the other directors who would work with Peter Sellers talk about their kind of war stories about working with Peter Sellers. And one of them says, working with Peter Sellers, no matter how great it was never fun. And I think they all had the same idea that he was a genius. We were so excited to work with him, but it just didn't work out. And we were all kind of disappointed in him, but we all still loved him. And I'll bet we would all still work with him again if given the chance. Patrick, here's a comment from Patrick who says, I agree. Medak really wanted to make a great Peter Sellers comedy with one of his heroes, and it hurt him deeply that it went sideways. Yes, and I totally agree. And some critics have said this documentary is sort of a bitter person looking back on a failure. And I don't see it so much that way. I think there is some bitterness and there is some regret over the failure of the film. But I think in a way it's self-therapy, and it's watching this filmmaker go through this process where he's learning why he has been so upset for 48 years over what happened on this film. And I think he realizes towards the end that a lot of it was tied up in his feelings for Peter Sellers. There's the great anecdote in the film that Peter Medak recounts when he met up with Peter Sellers again for the last time. The first time after they finished Ghost in the Noonday Sun was also the last time they ever saw each other, when Peter Medak was making a movie, and on the soundstage next to where he was working, Peter Sellers was making, I think, Revenge of the Pink Panther. And Peter Sellers heard that Peter Medak was making a film next door and sent a note saying, hey, come over and meet me. It's so great to see you. And Peter Medak was very reluctant to go talk to him and ignored the note. And Peter Sellers then the next day said, why did you ignore me? And Peter Sellers didn't seem like he even thought there had been a problem making Ghost in the Noonday Sun. So for him, it was just a blip in a career, which I find interesting. And he wanted to reconcile with Peter Medak, and they drank long into the night. And Peter Sellers said, I'm going to buy back that movie for you, and we can re-edit it and recut it and give it back to Columbia. That never happened. But clearly, that's a complicated issue, that this did not impact Peter Sellers in the way that it impacted Peter Medak, which probably hurt a little bit as well. So let's talk a little bit about, I see some people are asking about Lost in La Mancha and the challenging genius of Terry Gilliam. I have a list here of a couple of films, movies about movies gone horribly wrong. And let's see if you've seen any of these and what you think about them. Of course, one of them is Lost in La Mancha, the Terry Gilliam, the film about the Terry Gilliam film about Don Quixote, which at that time was starring Johnny Depp, which was a huge disaster. Gilliam did not finish the film, although he did end up finishing the film in 2018 with an entirely new cast, including Adam Driver. That film was not great, in my opinion. The documentary about the making of the original film that never got made was fascinating, I think. Terry Gilliam, of course, also a famously flamboyant and maybe troubled director. That was a really interesting film. Also, Lost in La Mancha, interestingly, was edited by someone who teaches film at the University of Arizona right now. So that's interesting. Another film is Oh, Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Journey, which I would highly recommend if you have not seen this. That's a 1991 documentary about the making of Apocalypse Now, which was made by 3 directors, one of them being Eleanor Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola's wife at the time, because she was on the set of Apocalypse Now and she shot all this footage while they were making the film. And as you know, Martin Sheen had a heart attack. Marlon Brando, of course, was there, so you know it's not going to be an easy shoot. That's an incredible documentary about a film that went horribly wrong, but still was finished and ended up as an amazing movie. So it can happen. Also, Burden of Dreams is another great one by Les Blank. That's a documentary about the making of the Werner Herzog film Fitzcarraldo, which if you have seen that film, that's about the people that, Klaus Kinski, who gets a bunch of people to help him drag an opera house on a boat over a mountain in Peru, which they really did for the movie, and people died making the film. They got squashed by the boat. And Werner Herzog, of course, and Klaus Kinski, oil and water. But they worked well together. They made great films. Fitzcarraldo is an amazing film, but this documentary is mind-blowing, just seeing what Herzog put his cast and his crew through. It's kind of amazing. There's also a lesser-known film called The Epic That Never Was from 1965, and this is about a film that never got made, a film version of I, Claudius. And it was going to star Charles Laughton as Claudius. It was going to be directed by Joseph von Sternberg in 1937. And a lot of crazy things happened to that film. Like I said, it was never completed, never got made. But the documentary indicates that it could have been a pretty interesting film, especially with Sternberg and Charles Laughton involved. But it did not get made. Another one, and this is Ben Mackey. Yes, I'm going to talk about this. Speaking of Brando, Lost Soul, The Doomed Journey of Richard Stanley's Island of Dr. Moreau. Yes. Now, what is the common theme here with a lot of these movies about movies gone horribly wrong? Marlon Brando. So the movie that Ben's referring to, Lost Soul, is about the making of the film Island of Dr. Moreau, which was directed by Richard Stanley, who was kicked off the film after only, I believe, 1 day of shooting. And then John Frankenheimer was brought in by the studio to finish the film. And then Richard Stanley snuck back onto the set of Island of Dr. Moreau dressed as one of the monsters in the film with a mask on. So nobody knew it was him, and he watched what happened with the film because he didn't want to let it go. Fascinating. And Marlon Brando is in the film with an ice bucket on his head and a big white robe and white face paint. And Val Kilmer is in the film. So that's a twofer. Marlon Brando and Val Kilmer together on a film is going to be trouble. And Val Kilmer was doing a Marlon Brando impersonation in the film, so that's very strange. The documentary is fascinating. The movie Island of Dr. Moreau, I think kind of like Ghost in the Noonday Sun, is kind of a mess, but it's kind of more of a train wreck mess. It's more entertaining to watch than Ghost in the Noonday Sun, I think. So I'd recommend both of those. Yes, a couple of comments about Jodorowsky's Dune. So that's a film by Frank Pavich. It's a documentary about Alejandro Jodorowsky's never completed version of Frank Herbert's Dune, which is a great documentary. That's an interesting example of a film that never got made, but still became incredibly influential on Hollywood history. Influenced a lot of films, including Blade Runner, the set design from Dune, the kind of set pieces that Jodorowsky was dreaming up showed up in a lot of other films like Blade Runner. I think some of it maybe showed up in Alien. It's a fascinating documentary, but clearly that film, the Jodorowsky's version of Dune, was never going to be made. It was too expensive. It was too wild. But it has seeped into culture. And the documentary about it is just really great. Yes, Steven Spotero talks about, yes, Jodorowsky's Dune would have been wild with Salvador Dali, Orson Welles, and Mick Jagger. Like, that is a cast. Marlon Brando was not involved, so maybe it would have worked. I don't know. Someone else is commenting, there's also Brothers in Arms, the making of Platoon, suggested by Bill Binder. Yes, that's an interesting one. Platoon, of course, had a lot of, it's an Oliver Stone film, so there's a lot of stuff going on in that film. One other film I wanted to mention is a more recent film called The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened. And this was a documentary about the making of a film that was never made. It was a new Superman film, which was to be directed by Tim Burton and was written by Kevin Smith of Clerks fame, and was going to star Nicolas Cage as Superman. And you can see footage online and in the film of Nicolas Cage dressed in the Superman costume, and boy, wouldn't that have been crazy. Chris Rock was going to be Jimmy Olsen in the film. Sandra Bullock was going to be Lois Lane. The project was killed 3 weeks before filming started because, well, you'll have to watch that documentary to find out, but clearly it was ill-fated from the beginning. Patrick mentions that the Jodorowsky's Dune, a lot of the Jodorowsky scenery was due to Jean Genet. Yes. Probably the Jodorowsky's Dune is one of the better movies about movies gone horribly wrong, because the Dune movie didn't go horribly wrong. It just didn't get made because it was still, it never went to the filming stage. So it was all pre-planning, which was very unusual. It fell apart at that point. So kind of different. Oh, Jean Giraud. Yes, the Mobius. Yes, not Jean Genet. So there's a whole raft of these movies about movies gone horribly wrong. And if you enjoyed The Ghost of Peter Sellers and just enjoy Hollywood history in general, I would highly suggest checking out any of those movies. I would also throw in the movie American Movie, which is a documentary from 1999 by Chris Smith, which is about the making of a low-budget horror film called Coven, or as they say in the film, Coven, because it was shot in Wisconsin, and they use the accent, so they call it Coven. And it's about an amateur filmmaker named Mark Borchardt trying to make this horror film, and kind of the things that go horribly wrong with this horror film. It's funny and charming, and it's kind of an inspiring look at movie making against all the odds. And that movie should have fallen apart, but this filmmaker finished the movie, and it went on to a certain level of infamy because of American Movie, the documentary they made about him making the movie. It's a little bit like a Christopher Guest mockumentary about movie making, except it's real, and it's really, really good. American Movie. I would highly recommend that. So yes, we're getting ready to wrap up here, but this has been really interesting. I hope you enjoyed the film. If you haven't watched the film Ghost of Peter Sellers, I hope you check it out. It's still streaming through the Loft Cinema. You can get to it on our website. And seeing Peter Sellers doing anything, I think, is worthwhile, even when he's being a little bit of an SHIT. It's still fascinating to watch. I think in a lot of ways he is still to this day, 40 years, some years after his death, still one of our greatest comedic American British actors, actually. And again, it's something about his certain blankness as a human being that I think made him very unique as a comedic actor, which comedic actors today don't really have that blankness, because comedic actors today are, for the most part, selling their personalities. So if you think about comedic actors like Adam Sandler, I don't know, a number of very popular comedic actors today, they're really sort of playing variations of themselves. And I don't know that Peter Sellers had himself to play, which makes him fascinating. Do we have one more comment here? Patrick says, thank you. I enjoyed the film and the discussion. Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you all for joining me here. I just wanted to say that the Loft Cinema will be back in operation at some point soon. We are waiting until we can reopen safely and responsibly, but we will let everyone know when that day comes. Hopefully it's not too far in the future, but until that happens, we're going to continue to be streaming virtual cinema through the Loft Cinema website. So please make sure you watch lots of movies. Please keep safe. Please keep thinking about films. We'll keep having these movie discussions because I really miss talking to all of you at the theater about movies. So we're going to keep doing that virtually. Thank you for watching, and please be thankful that you did not have to make a film with Peter Sellers, but that you can just watch films with Peter Sellers. That's the takeaway here. Thank you. Good night.